So let us now dive into the primary source, the text The Uncanny, in a translation by Alex Strange is what you should see on the left-hand side with some of my um, attempts at translating and highlighting some different aspects. And on the right-hand side, you should see my notes, which hopefully give some kind of structure or guidance for discussing and conversing about the text and looking at some of what I conceive of as key points. So let's just use this possibility to look into my notes. And what we already talked about is the un in the uncanny. So the prefix un, you have that in the English word uncanny, but you also have that in the German word unheimlich. So, and the prefix an is an negating prefix. So rather than meaning homely, so heimlich in German is homely, it's the unhomely. It's that which is unhomely to us. So this is the literal translation of unheimlich. And sorry, and so well, you may know this such a negating prefix if you once looked into Heidegger and you saw the Greek ancient Greek notion aletheia. You have the alpha privativum, the a, which is right negating what is coming after, and what is coming after is Lethe is the river of forgetfulness or forgetting, and so aletheia is what is rescued from forgetting, and in that sense it's resurrected. Something is recurring in in terms of aletheia, but also in terms of what is unheimlich, as we will see, because we talked about it. The prefix an, is in a Freudian reading is the token of repression, as he says. So it's the brand or marker of suppression. So suppression and repression are I use them in a synonym way, so they are both translations of Verdrängung in German. In German, the German word is Verdrängung. So a more literal translation would be to push something, or something is pushed or drawn away into, you could say, it's not clear where it is pushed or drawn towards, but maybe some cleavage or some scene of absence, something that is not directly accessible, or that it's not present for us, that is not accessible to us. Okay, so the un is the prefix un is the token of repression. So what it marks and what it signifies and signals is that something is suppressed, and in that sense is covered, is not graspable. It's not accessible to our grasp. So I think what it wants to say is that we cannot normally get a grip onto it, which doesn't mean that it isn't that it doesn't temporalize. It's some kind of effect that isn't there in some sense. That's not what it means, but it means that that it's kind of covered over. It's if you want to use a Heideggerian vocabulary, it's concealed rather than unconcealed. So, because this is Heidegger's translation, Unverborgenheit is his translation of aletheia. So, what is not concealed, what is not covered, and in that sense, what is resurrected or rescued from the river of forgetfulness. And okay, and what is kind of means that what this means, I think, is that what is suppressed and repressed in terms of contents, and what is connected to these repressions um, can kind of crop up again. It can come to the fore again, and it can kind of disturb and interrupt our everyday dealings, the way we normally go about our lives, and what we conceive as ordinary, as normal. So this is just a recap, looking at my notes, and there is also the remark or the title of another of Freud's essays, a longer essay from a little bit later. It's from 1926. It's called Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety. So anxiety in the sense of Angst, which we kind of conceive of as the leitmotif of the series. And I made a video about this text by Freud, and it's really helpful, or was really helpful, to look how Freud is conceiving of anxiety in the context of inhibition, symptoms, and anxiety. So because he's explaining anxiety with regard to something he calls Angstsignal, so the Angst signal. And what is really important is that signal is a really specific category of science, of semiotics. So if you want to go about from or want to access this or approach it from a semiotic perspective, you could go with a understanding or a conceptualization by Charles Sanders Peirce, and he proposes 3 kinds of categories in terms of science. So I mean, in detail it's more complex, but what he offers or what he analytically derives as categories, looking at science and sign processes, or the study of sign processes, is called semiotic or semiology. And what he offers is the symbols, then symbols, icons, and indices. So, and signals are part of the category called indices. They are also part of this category are symptoms and so symptoms are part of it, and signals. And just trying to recover my thought at this moment. Okay, so, and how he explains these categories is by saying, symbols, they are characterized, or what they're what their differentiating element is that they are conventional. So in a Saussurean understanding, they are arbitrary. They are wholly arbitrary. So the word in French, de Saussure uses the example of arbre, so the French word for tree, and he explains that using the word arbre is totally arbitrary. So in German we could use the word Baum, and in English we could use the word tree. So, but what word we use isn't decisive. So, but the peculiar aspect in terms of semiotics, going about from Saussure, is that it's a differential logic. So that you have one element and it gets its meaning. So its meaning is expressed by what it refers to, but this is only coming about by the differentiating or the differentiating movement or process that this element is kind of embedded into with regard to all other signs. So it's a purely differentiating system, or a system of differentiation, better to say it in this way. So symbols are purely arbitrary. They are conventional. So there is no we cannot make a nexus from the symbol to what it signifies, from the sign to what is signified. So because, right, we cannot deduce or we cannot guess from, if we don't know a language, we couldn't guess from the word to what it signifies, because it's arbitrary. It only makes sense in the system of language and in this system of differentiation between elements that are structurally connected into a net. And then again, Peirce has a category called, or proposes a category called icons. And icons are motivated signs. So they have something in common. They resemble what they are referring to in some sense. So you can imagine, for example, in the sense of that we know from our computer desktops, there you can have an icon, and it could kind of resemble, like, let's say, a lake, and you could also imagine that icon on a map. And if you now go about producing this icon, right, you could draw like the contour of a particular lake, and so you would have the contour of this specific particular lake, and it would be as a contour, if you, I don't know, add some more elements that are iconic, that are kind of prototypical for a lake, you would have like an icon of a lake, but this icon is motivated by something that you encountered in your environment. Nevertheless, you could also abstract from this particular lake and make a generic contour of a imagined lake. So there wouldn't be like a real pendant, something that the icon resembles to, or that it mimics. Right, that some trait would be would be copied in a way. So you can imagine that. So there's a, right, it's on a scale, but nevertheless, if you have or what is specific about an icon, let's say it like this, what is specific about an icon is that you have something in the form of the iconic symbol that draws on a trait and that resembles of something that is of the specificities of what the icon as a sign is referring to, right? And you could have a generic icon of lakes in general that do not represent any particular lake that is out there in our environment somewhere in the landscape, but nevertheless that could be an icon. So icons are motivated. And then again we have indices, and indices are likely to be in a causal relationship to what they are referring to. So one example Peirce is using is like the smoke is an index of fire. So you will only witness and observe smoke if there is a fire. So there's a causal relationship. Nevertheless, there is some critique on that. So does it have to be causal, right? So Lacan is looking at this example specifically, and Lacan says, well, it could also be a smoker that is causing the smoke, right? So, and then you would also have like a fire, of course, the cigarette, but it's totally other context, right? It's somebody more or less consciously, perhaps, or unconsciously deciding to go about and smoke a cigarette. And what we are really interested in asking after that is if it is a person that is causing the smoke, or if it's just a natural event by chance. So this is kind of Lacan's take on that, and of course it's more complex and there's more to it, but just to say that the notion of causality is of course always really strict, and it's a really specific context. Nevertheless, we could say that kind of the nexus of the index and what it is referring to is or has something to do with being responsible for, so, or being adapted to would be Heidegger's take on that. So being adapted to, perhaps we could say that. So there is there is an indebtedness and of the index to what is indexed, or of the index sign and what it is kind of referring or referencing to. So in medical terms, they talk about etiology, and this is in German Ursachenforschung. So what is the Ursache, the Ursake? That is kind of the principle, and it's always hard to translate because in English you will always have to say like principle, cause, and they always run into something like causality, right? Okay, but I hope you get what I'm up to there. So these are the indices, and so indices are on another level, not just not just referring to a formal category that is called causality. Someone who is really bringing this or thematizing this and stressing that is a German theoretician in cultural theory and media theory, he's called Dietrich Dietrichson, and he wrote a book which is called the index effects, and he speaks of the index effects in terms of what he calls nachpopuläre Künste, so after popular culture, cultural art, after popular art, sorry. And what he says is that there is a specific effect to the index that is used in terms of television and in terms of the new media. And he says that this, or he describes this effect with something like a punch, and he calls this Körpertreffer. The English translation would be body punch, or body hit. And this is referring to that something of the indice is signaling from the real corporal kind of from the real corporal events that is referenced by television, for example. And I think the uptake from this is, or kind of the something that we can take up from there, is that it is not just a formal analytic category, but it is really attacking and tackling the body. So in German we have this word angehen, which is something like tackling or attacking. So it really goes against or goes after and concerns the body, but not just the body. The body is always in the sense that you have something that it's more or less external, something like a corp. But right in German we have also this word Leib, which is something else than Körper. So Körper would be body in English, and then you would have something like something differentiated from this. So Körper and body is always more or less external, looking at the corp, or the corporal constitution as something that is enclosed and that has a clear-cut boundary between inner and outer. And the notion Leib, which I would translate as something like perhaps corporal. let me just look if I have something else. Yeah, just corporeal, or I think then Merleau-Ponty talks about the flesh, right? There, there isn't that clear-cut boundary between inside and outside, and it's not as easily, or the flesh, the corporeal flesh is not just as easily describable and identifiable in terms of clear-cut contours, looking from an external view on the human body. And nevertheless, what it wants to say is that the indices, or there's something about the effect of indices, what Dietrichson wants to say, and that this tackles the body. And I think this is really important because, right, one categories of indices are the symptoms, and symptoms have something corporeal to them, right? They can turn out as something insisting as bodily symptoms. And then again, right, we have the signals, and signals also have or are standing in a relation, are standing in a relation to the real. So they are not totally arbitrary. Nevertheless, they are never, they are never natural. So you don't have, by any means, also in Peirce, you don't have a natural indices. You have always quasi-natural indices. So that is to say, you never have like a something that is a cause that is, natural in that sense, because always what is happening, or what we are referring to when we're using signs out of that category, there's always already a signification process ongoing, so a sign process, and Peirce calls this semiosis, and this is a process which is happening between three moments, and these are moments, not like fixed elements. And this is the interpretant, the reference, and the sign. And between these three moments, you have an ongoing processual event or occurrence, and nevertheless, this semiosis, this process of signification, whereby an interpretant is drawn into, or is part of that semiosis of the sign process, is kind of is hit, or is gets kind of gets struck by, or can get struck by a signal, right? And this is important because what this means is that angst signals can come, or can kind of interrupt our signification process, and that means also our symbolic order and our kind of social organizational context in which we embed ourselves and which we find hold, and can interrupt that and disturb that. And the signals are coming from the real, right? They are, in that sense, coming from pure negativity, because what is happening in terms of semiosis, in terms of this process of signification and the sign process, there's always mediation happening, right? This is coming up in Hegel, of course. So you have this process of mediation between three moments, and but what the real then is not signifying, because it cannot be signified, but what it brings to this process of signification is, or can only be, an interruption or a disturbance, a cut, a cleavage, something negative, because the real is pure negativity, if you want so, and it is as such not, it's not, there's no medial difference. So right, a sign, so applying a concept to something, or assigning a sign to an object, is always safeguarding a distance, or is always bringing the interpretant into a distance to what is to the referent, to what is referred to. But this distance, or this difference, this differentiation, is is eliminated, or is not something that is at stake in the real. So there is no difference, there is no medial differentiation, or no medial difference in terms of the real. That's why the real is and mediation in the most radical sense is pure negativity, and this is Hegel's probably most striking insights. From there upon, he builds his whole philosophical system. Okay, and so, and this is, I think one can read this quote in the lines I just sketched. It's a quote from Wittgenstein, from the Logical Investigations, and he says there, or it's more or less a short, something like an allegory or something comparable. So he says, misleading parallel. Psychology treats of processes in the psychical sphere as does physics in the physical. So in this he calls a misleading parallel, that you have on the one side, the psychology, which treats processes of the psyche, so the psychical sphere, and on the other side you have physics, which is treating like phenomena and subject matters in the physical sphere, perhaps something like something concerned with matter, right? And he says this is like a misleading parallel, that there is a clear-cut differentiation or even opposition between these spheres, and that you have like two separated realms or kind of fields that they study. And this is exactly also what is going on between the body and the corporal constitution, which is called Leib in German, the flesh in Merleau-Ponty, that you do not have this clear-cut opposition. And this means, first of all, that the relation between inside and outside isn't as easy stabilizable, or you cannot easily stabilize the relation between inside and outside, or the differentiation between inside and outside. And this has huge implications. One can at least question if this has huge implications. So okay, now going about the questions I wrote here that concern or perhaps even haunt us in regard of angst, this emphatic notion of angst, which is really kind of, it's it's not dread, as we already mentioned. It's not fear of something, but it is like an existential anxiety, and it concerns our being in the world, as Heidegger would say, and it is objectless, so it concerns this another spatiality and another relation. It's not about intentionality. We are not concerned with any particular object or identifiable object in this kind of angst, and it is in German you could say it's Angst for sense of Weltverlust. It's a anxiety of losing the world, or how do you say, the loss of the world. So there's a whole withdrawal of what it means to have and to be in a world. And so what is this angst? What is kind of the ontological question, if you want so, the question of the Quidditas, die Wahrheit, was ist Angst? Then what does our aesthetic dealings with anxiety consist in? So how do we cope with aesthetically? So aesthetically means in terms of perception, first of all. So aesthesis, from the ancient Greek word aesthesis, so what concerns the senses and perceptibility. And how do we comport ourselves towards that trait of angst? And then again, another question: how can our dealings with anxiety, with this kind of anxiety, this emphatic notion of angst, decisively be described? How can our relation to these, our practices, be analyzed? And I think this is what Freud is also concerned with, or in terms of the uncanny. Okay, so let's look now a little bit in the text. And right, we looked at the first 2 pages, and I think we can start now on page 2. And then we start, we just start with in his study. So in his study of the uncanny, Jentsch quite rightly lays stress on the obstacle presented by the fact that people vary so very greatly in their sensitivity to this quality of feeling. The writer of the present contribution indeed must himself plead guilty to a special obtuseness in the matter where extreme delicacy of perception would be more in place. It is long since he has experienced or heard of anything which has given him an uncanny impression, and he will be obliged to translate himself into that state of feeling and to awaken in himself the possibility of it before he begins. So Freud, when he says, okay, he heard of that impression, and he's kind of aware that this is something that is there, that is can be observed, and that kind of concerns people, but it's not that it's something he would experience in recent times. Still, difficulties of this kind make themselves felt powerfully in many other branches of aesthetics. We need, on this account, despair of finding instances in which the quality in question will be recognized without hesitation by most people. So he says it's not so easily to find cases or instances of this phenomenon, of this subject matter, the uncanny, where people kind of witness in a a broader group, or over a broader set, the kind of quality in question with the uncanny, and the feeling that is connected to it, or the phenomena as such. So it seems to be to some degree individual. So there seems to be individual factors. Otherwise, right, we would perhaps see more or less situations where more or less a whole group of people would witness such a quality of impression and feeling that one would call uncanny. 2 courses are open to us at the start. Either we can find out what meaning has come to be attached to the word uncanny in the course of its history, or we can collect all those properties of persons, things, sensations, experiences, and situations which arouse in us the feeling of uncanniness, and then infer the unknown nature of the uncanny from what they all have in common. Okay, so here he's like really having more or less or what means more or less, he has a philosophical question. So how do we get at the meaning and at what is signified by the word uncanny? So what meaning, he says, is attached to the word. And he says, okay, this is kind of the etymological approach, right? We can look in the course of history and kind of collect all those properties and attributes and so on that are attributed or assigned towards the arousal of such a feeling and impression of uncanniness. And then we can kind of infer from that, from all that we collected out of the history, or from etymological grounds, the nature of the uncanny. Something that they all have in common, something like the essence of the uncanny. So this is the one possibility he proposes. Okay, no. So the first possibility is kind of the etymological possibility, right? Looking at what meaning was attached to the word uncanny in the course of history, and the other possibility is that we collect all the properties and kind of attributes that are assigned to the feeling and impression that is connected to the phenomenon of subject matter of uncanniness, to the arousal of such a feeling. I will say at once that both courses lead to the same result. The uncanny is that class of the terrifying which leads back to something, known to us, once familiar, very familiar. How this is possible, in what circumstances the familiar can become uncanny and frightening, and I shall show in what follows. Sorry. Let me also add that my investigation was actually begun by collecting a number of individual cases and only later received confirmation after I'd examined what language could tell us. So he really wants to hear into language and wants to kind of get the whole spectrum that is connected to the word uncanny, as we will see. So the whole fundus of the Sprachkorpus, the corp of language of a folk. So in this discussion, however, I shall follow the opposite course. The German word unheimlich is obviously the opposite of heimlich. Heimisch meaning familiar, native, belonging to the home. And we are tempted to conclude that what is uncanny is frightening precisely because it is not known and familiar. Naturally, not everything which is new and unfamiliar is frightening. However, the relation cannot be inverted. We can only say that what is novel can easily become frightening and uncanny. Some new things are frightening, but not by any means all. Something has to be added to what is novel and unfamiliar to make it uncanny. Okay, so not everything new and not everything that we encounter, so to say, freshly, that we are not familiar with is uncanny. But some other traits, something else, right? Some other moment has to be added, not to be added, but has to also be at work there. On the whole, Jentsch did not get beyond this relation of the uncanny to the novel and unfamiliar. He ascribes the essential factor in the production of the feeling of uncanniness, so what kind of causes or lets arise the arousal of the quality of feeling connected to uncanniness, to intellectual uncertainty, so that the uncanny would always be that in which one does not know where one is, as it were. So this is very interesting, which one does not know where one is. So this is a matter, or a concern of orientation, right? Of spatial orientation, where one is. So where one is relative to everything else, most probably. how one is directed towards the environment, and how the surrounding is organized and is standing in a constellation relative to oneself. So this is really interesting, that it's a concern of orientation and of spatiality. The better oriented, so now the term oriented, in his environment a person is, the less readily will he get the impression of something uncanny in regard to the objects and events in it. The better oriented in his environment a person is, the less readily will he get the impression of something uncanny in regard to the object and events in it. So this is tremendously important, I guess, because it means that the capability and the kind of the means of orientation, so how well we can orient ourselves spatially, and orientation is not purely bound spatially. You may know that Kant wrote an essay called how to orient in thinking, or in terms of thinking, how one orients in terms of thinking. So you can also raise up the question of orientation in terms of thinking. Perhaps this is where the question emanates first of all. We don't know this, but we don't know this yet, at least. But here he makes the relation between orientation and the environment. Okay, so and the better one is oriented in one's environment, the less probable it is, or readily will someone get the impression of something uncanny. So that means that uncanniness seems to be, for Freud, in some sense correlated with one's orientation in an environment. And this means also how well one is, or how strong one is anchored in the environment, right? How one is attached or coupled to the environment. I think these are good ways to approach this, how well one is coupled or attached to the environment. And when this coupling is kind of breaking loose, or when something is disturbing or interrupting this coupling, then it is more probable one will more readily get the impression of something uncanny. Okay, it is not difficult to see that this definition is incomplete, and we will therefore try to proceed beyond the equation of unheimlich with unfamiliar. We will first turn to other languages, but foreign dictionaries tell us nothing new, perhaps only because we speak a different language. Indeed, we get the impression that many languages are without a word for this particular variety of what is fearful. So that these languages do not have a word for it, right? And it seems questionable if they knew then the phenomena if they don't have a word. I mean, that's at least a question I would raise here. I wish to express my indebtedness to Dr. Reich for the following excerpts. Okay, so now from Deutsch-Lateinisches Wörterbuch von Gorges. Ein unheimlicher Ort, an uncanny place, locus suspectus, in unheimlicher Nachtzeit, in the dismal night hours. Now from the Greek xenos, strange, foreign. English from the English, sorry. Uncomfortable, uneasy, gloomy, dismal, uncanny, ghastly, of a house haunted, of a man, a repulsive fellow. French, inquietant, yeah, I think it's right. Sinistre. Okay, Spanish, I don't know. But the Italian and the Portuguese seem to content themselves with words which we should describe as circumlocutions. In Arabic and Hebrew, uncanny means the same as demonic, gruesome. Let us therefore return to the German language. In Daniel Sanders' Wörterbuch der deutschen Sprache, 1860, the following remarks, abstracted in translation, are found upon the word heimlich. I have laid stress on certain passage by italicizing them. Heimlich, also heimlich. heimlich, belonging to the house, not strange, familiar, tame, intimate, comfortable, homely, obsolete, belonging to the house or the family, or regarded as so belonging, familiaris. Die Heimlichen, the members of the household, der heimliche Rat, him to whom secrets are revealed. So we will see that the notion of secret and revelation is especially for Schelling really important with regard to the uncanny. Now more usually geheimer Rat, private counselor, heimlicher, of animals, tame, companionable to man, as opposed to wild animals that are trained to be heimlich and accustomed to man. So, right, we speak of domestication when animals are getting accustomed to man, or they are getting dressed up and set up to live with man. If these young creatures are brought up from early days among man, they become quite heimlich, friendly. Now then, again, friendly, intimate, home-like, the enjoyment of quiet content. So we have the notion of quietness, something that is clinging to silence, arousing a sense of peaceful pleasure and security, as in one within the four walls of his house. So there's this notion of encapsulation, of enclosement, right, of security through walls, through boundaries that separate an inside from an outside. Is it still heimlich to you in your country where strangers are feeling your woods? Quote, she did not feel all too heimlich with him, to destroy the Heimlichkeit of the home. I could not readily find another spot to intimate and heimlich as this, in quite Heinzlichkeit, surrounded by close walls. So close walls, a careful housewife or houseman who knows how to make a pleasing Heimlichkeit, Häuslichkeit, so belonging to the home. And then we have all kinds of notion that are in the associated field of heimlich, or also heimatlich, so the homestead, der Freund, der Nachbar, neighbor, also notion Heidegger's talking of, right, in der Nachbarschaft zum Sein, so in the neighborhood, living in the neighbor, dwelling in the neighborhood of being. Okay, so then the sentinel's horn sounds so heimlich from the tower, and his voice invites so hospitably. So now this is interesting because the horn sounds and also the ringing of the bells, for example, they are signals, right? And Heidegger is also really interested in, right, he was in his youth, he was like ringing the bells, he was Messner, so he was working and participating in the church, and so the liturgy, so the liturgical elements like the ring of the bells and the horn sounds, as well as the ring of the bells, they are signal mediums. And this is not something I come up by myself, but this is a observation by the media theoretician Bernhard Siegert from Weimar, that here we have signal medias, and you remember that signal is a specific sign category in Peirce, and it has something from of the real. That is why also we, right, when we drive a car and we hit on the honk, right? So we sound the horn and we beep, right? This is also a signal medium, and it's at some point Peirce talks about the indices also in terms of blind force, and I think this gets us an idea what this should mean, or blind compulsion, coercion, and some kind of duress. And I think this gets us a notion and a first approximation why this is the case. So when we are hitting the honk, right, in the car, everybody else will hopefully you know yeah will turn to the signal, yeah, and in that sense in that sense will be frightened or scared, yeah, will we started to shackling and to be frightened, and this is also what it's intended to do, right? Okay, so this form of the word ought to become general in order to protect the word from becoming obsolete in its good sense through any easy confusion with two. Okay, so then we have again heimlich a lot of times. One cannot walk over it without always having the feeling that water might come up there again. Oh, we call it unheimlich, you call it heimlich. Well, what makes you think that there is something secret and untrustworthy about this family? So again, the notion of secret and the secretive. Concealed, kept from sight. So here we have the notion of concealment, kept from sight, so covered, so that others do not get to know about it. Withheld from others. Withheld is, I think, a really interesting word in the in the English vernacular. Withheld. So it's hold away, and it's in that sense withdrawn. It's out of the grasp. Geheim, secret. So also Heimlichkeit for Geheimnis, secret. To do something heimlich, behind someone's back, to steal away. Meeting and appointments, to look on with, so heimliche meetings, secretive meetings. Look on with heimlich pleasure at someone's discomfiture, or sigh or weep, heimlich, to behave heimlich, as though there was something to conceal, heimlich, love affair, sin. So we have this notion of sin, it's also really interesting, so sinfulness, also right in German we have this notion of Sinn, which is connected to the English word sin. Heimlich, but in German sin is something like sense or the sensual. Heimlich, places which good manners oblige us to conceal. So it's something that is concealed from good manners, from the kind of the rules of how one behaves and what is kind of appropriate for the public. The heimlich chamber, privy. To throw into pits or Heimlichkeit, let the steeds heimlich before Laomedon, as secretive, heimlich, deceitful and malicious towards cruel masters. As frank, open, sympathetic and helpful towards a friend in misfortune. The heimlich art, magic, is also super interesting. We have the notion of master and the notion of a secretive art or a heimliche art, something that is withheld from the public. Magic, where public, and then of course magic is so associated with a master, right? A master of magic and someone who knows the dark art, right? Where public ventilation has to stop, their heimlich machinations begin. So I highlighted that because I found that super striking, right? Where public ventilation, so where the public discourse stops, and what public ventilations does not seem to find appropriate, there, at this precise point, heimlich machinations, privative machinations begin. And this is super telling with regard to some of the notions in Heidegger, but also in Nietzsche, for example, right? The wheelwork, the uncanny wheelwork, the machinations that go about in silence and are not part of the public ventilation, that there's no how do you say there is no, in German you say Sand aufgewirbelt, and I think this is fitting to the notion of ventilation, right? There's no whirling up of sand in this kind of affairs, because the public wants to hold that in a place or a realm where it isn't conversed about. So it's not addressed by public ventilations. Freedom is the whispered watchword of Heimlich, conspirators, and the loud battle cry of professed revolutionaries, a wholly Heimlich effect. So here we have the notion of effect, which I talked about with regard to the index effect. There's also, it seems to be a Heimlich effect. At least this is what the quote is suggesting. I have roots that are most heimlich. I'm grown in the deep earth. This is associative of Heidegger, right? The earth that is the moment in the fourfold right, which is withholding or holding to itself something, which is not giving all at once, and which cannot be kind of grasped in a way where everything is available, but the earth covers and holds to itself, ist an sich selbst beständig, and it's also part of, so it's standing in itself, you could say, and it's also keeping to itself, holding to itself, and concealing. So there's always a trait of concealment, of withdrawal in terms of the earth. And this is something, I think, connected here to Heimlich, which is going on in secret, in secretive way. So the kind of the movements and what is going on underneath the earth is kept from sight, right? My Heimlich pranks to discover, disclose, betray someone's Heimlichkeiten. So looking into that which is not obvious, that which is not, perhaps also not intended for the public, but which is also not shown or indicated in terms of publicly behavior. To concoct Heimlichkeiten behind my back, compounds, and especially also the opposite follow meaning. I above. Unheimlich, uneasy, eerie, so the notion of eeriness, weirdness, blood curdling, seeming almost unheimlich and ghostly to him. I had already long since felt an unheimlich, even gruesome feeling, feels an unheimlich horror. So the notion of horror is really becoming, not stress, but becoming relevant in terms of our aesthetic coping with the uncanniness and anxiety, Angst. Unheimlich and motionless, like a stone image. This is also something which will become relevant, the stone image, the frozen in time and kind of, carved carved and figurated in terms of solid material. The unheimlich, mist called hillfog. These pale youths are unheimlich and are brewing heaven, brewing heaven knows what mischief. Okay, unheimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained. That ought to have remained. It's also interesting. So unheimlich is this name for everything that ought to have remained. That ought to have remained hidden and secret and has become visible. And this is from Schelling, I guess. Yeah, this is from Schelling. It ought to have remained, and it ought to have remained hidden and a secret, but it has become visible. It was pulled and put into the realm of the visible. So what is produced, there was a production perhaps of visibility, and something was set and placed into the field of visibility. In that sense, it was ripped from out of being a secret and putting into availability and in accessibility. And that was kind of, that is kind of tearing perhaps tearing onto that what ought to have remained, hidden and secret. To veil the divine, to surround it with a certain Unheimlichkeit. So to veil the divine, right? To kind of not only cover it, but to in a versatile veil. So in German you can say anschmiegen und schmiegsam, so to which is supple, so subtly and to supple and pliable, kind of yeah, pliable, subtle, the holy. I think this is a really interesting theme in Schelling, the holy or the divine. Unheimlich is not often used as opposite to meaning two. What interests us most in this long extract is to find that among its different shades of meaning, the word heimlich exhibits one which is identical with its opposite, unheimlich. The word heimlich exhibits one meaning which is identical with its opposite, unheimlich. What is heimlich thus comes to be unheimlich. So what is homely can become unhomely. The quotation from Gutzkow, we call it unheimlich, you call it heimlich. In general, we are reminded that the word heimlich is not unambiguous, but belongs to two sets of ideas, which, without being contradictory, are yet very different. On the one hand, it means that which is familiar and congenial, and on the other, that which is concealed and kept out of sight. The word unheimlich is only used customarily, we are told, as the contrary of the first signification and not of the second. Sanders tells us nothing concerning a possible genetic connection between these two sorts of meanings. On the other hand, we notice that Schelling says something which throws quite a new light on the concept of the uncanny, one which we had certainly not awaited. According to him, everything is uncanny that ought to have remained hidden and secret and yet comes to light. And yet comes to light. That ought to have remained hidden and secret, but yet comes to light. It's pulled into unconcealedness. Right? It's resurrected. And in a sense perhaps also recovered from forgetfulness or from that which is covered over. Some of the doubts that have thus arisen are removed if we consult Grimm's dictionary. And yeah, I think here we can make a break and then we will go about to Grimm's dictionary in the next session. So thank you really much and until next time.